Hi, this is Teresa's Crafty Cabana, and today I'm going to show you what I did with these prints that I did on a long haul recently. I'll put together a video on how I made this. I have a short that I'll link. So what I did to get started is I pulled out some watercolor paper. This is a pad from Michael's Artist Loft 90 pound. That means it's thinner than the 140 pound traditional Canson, I think is what I have usually, but I wanted something a little bit thinner because I knew I was going to use this as a card base, and I also knew I was going to have a lot of layers on here. And the reason I used watercolor paper is because it was going to hold a lot of liquid. My inspiration for this technique comes from Instagram, and this is an artist, Leanne DeQuina Art. I believe she's out of Australia, and she makes these really beautiful flowers from her gel prints. And I was just trying to watch her videos to see sort of what process she's using. And from what I gathered, she paints a little bit in the background, then takes her prints from tissue paper and kind of just rips them up to create petals and leaf shapes, and then glues them down with perhaps Mod Podge, a wet glue of some sort. And then kind of just creates these really beautiful flowers and layers. And then after that, she kind of goes in and does something really cool for the centers. I had to look around and I found this little short from her, and she does a liquid form of acrylic, it looks like, and puts it just in the center and uses a straw to kind of blow out the centers with different colors in them. So I'm kind of just taking that as my inspiration for what I'm going to be doing with my pieces. And again, her name is Leanne DeQuina Art on Instagram, and I'll link her in my description as well for her Instagram link. And I would definitely recommend checking her out. It's really fun to watch how she makes her artwork, and they're really beautiful. Mine don't turn out quite as beautiful as hers, but it is my first time, so I just thought it was really cool and I wanted to try it. So here I'm just ripping up some of my tissue paper gel prints and trying to pick areas that look like you can actually see the design. I used different colored tissue paper for mine, and then I have different paint colors over the top, and this gives it a little bit of variation. Here I'm just using my little background piece to see if my petals are small enough and to make sure they'll fit. Next, I'm going to get started on my background and adding some paint. I'm going to be using these India inks that I have in different colors from Bombay, Dr. P.H. Martin's, and I'm using a 3/4 inch flat angle brush. For now, I'm just getting the background wet, and while these are India inks, they react a little bit like watercolors. The difference is once the ink dries, you can't reconstitute them. So you have to do all your movement with them while they are still on wet paper, or while they're still wet. And as they dry, they kind of create these little spots around them. And unlike watercolors, you can kind of blend those out. India inks, you can't do that. So you have to work a little bit fast with the India inks, but I really liked the colors that I had, and I wanted some bright colors. And I knew that these would offer a really bright color for my background. In the center, I used some purple and blue, and then on the outside, I'm going to be focusing on the greens for where the leaves would be. My paper did curl up, but I'm kind of using that to get the paint to move. And this is going to be just a haphazard, getting some color on the paper, not really being too particular at this point, because most of this will be covered up with my petals that I'll be adding. I'm adding some darker green just to give that lighter green a little variation. Just kind of blending it out. And then I wanted to bring the purple down on this side a little bit more. The purple was getting kind of washed out. Next I used this Liquitex acrylic ink in copper, and I'm using that kind of to bring out a little sparkle in the leaf area, because the leaf area is really the only part of this painted background that's really going to show, because I'm not going to fill in all of the corners with my gel prints. So I'm just kind of blending it out kind of in the shape of some lines, and that will resemble leaves later on. I used my embossing heat tool to make sure it got really dry before I went in with the next step. I wanted to tone down some of those bright colors in the center just so that my gel print pieces would actually show. So I took some gesso in white and I just kind of went around the background in areas, and then in the center around the edges where like the leaf shapes were going to be, I started kind of blocking in leaf shapes and using that copper where I knew I was going to kind of keep the copper color showing, and just kind of did that around the whole background piece. And the thing I like about gesso is you can still see the paint color underneath, it just tones it down. So here it is with my gesso dried. And then I've got this collage medium from Ranger Distress, and I'm going to use that to apply my gel print petals. For the first layer, I just kind of started by adding the matte medium to the centers, just to make sure I liked it. I wasn't sure if I was going to maybe leave the outsides of the petals kind of loose so they can move, but then I realized with tissue paper they'll just get folded and then they wouldn't, it's not like paper where you could shape them. So I just glued those down. So it'll all be a flat layer on top of this background piece, and each of my petal layers are just going to kind of go over each other. One thing I did notice, which is pretty cool with tissue paper, is the tissue paper kind of disappears into the background, and really the paint layer, or the the part that you gel printed, is what really shows through. After I did all my petals, I'm coming in with some of my greens, and these are going to be more like my leaves. And you can just tear the extra pieces that kind of didn't fit quite on the page. They tear off nice and easy. Now I'm going to take some white acrylic. I wanted an opaque white, unlike my gesso, because I wanted to make sure that this really popped. I'm using a 2-inch round brush, and I'm just taking a little bit of paint around each of the petals. This really kind of highlights where the petals start and end. If you're just looking at it, it's kind of hard to tell where the different prints are. And I did notice in Leanne's videos, she does this as well. She'll kind of highlight with paint around the petals to give them a little more structure, I guess. And I am mostly following the shape of the cutout that I did, but some of them, if I didn't like exactly how they were on the page, I could use the paint to kind of define whether I wanted a pointy tip or a round tip to my petals. Here's an example. I didn't really like the shape of this one, so I was able to use my paint to make the edge of it a little more round. But for the areas that I did like, I was able to just trace those with my white. And I think this really gives a lot of definition to these petals. And you could even go in and kind of do some veining, but I liked it just like this. Now for the center, I'm trying to use just some regular paint and this copper paint. And I'm going to water down the white that I still have left on my palette here. And I'm trying to make it a wet enough paint that it will blow out the way she had done hers. So I just keep building up the paint and the water. And I've got a blower tool from Tim Holtz that I'm going to use instead of a straw. And that's what I'm going to use to blow out my centerpiece. I'll just keep adding white and copper, and I do end up adding in a little bit of brown like she had done as well, just to see if I could define some of the edges of this shape. The copper was getting a little bit lost, so I just dropped another drop of copper over the top. And then that was my attempt at making the centerpiece. Hers look a lot cooler, but I think it would be something that just takes practice. And I used a wet paper towel just to pull up some of the paint that had gone a little too far into the petals, because I didn't want the petals to be completely covered. To make the center stand out, I have some glitter here. It's kind of like a champagne color gold, light gold, and I'm just using that right in the center when the paint is still wet. And I don't shake off the excess. I'm just kind of spreading it around. Once the paint is completely dry, then I took it over to my trash can and just tipped it over and got rid of any loose pieces. The center part, of course, did take the longest to dry. I wanted some splatter on the background, so I just took watered down paint again and just kind of started splattering it on the petals. If you use a bigger brush, you can get bigger splatters. For a little bit of interest on my background, I used some Stāzon Timber Brown. I picked this stamp set by Stampers Anonymous, Tim Holtz, and it has some neat little pieces that I can just put in different areas. I'm using this one on some of the corners. Then I've got a texty one that I'll just use over some of the petals in the background. I'm just pressing in with my fingers instead of using a block because I don't want it to be perfect. Once I'm happy with that, I'll set it aside to continue drying. I'm going to be using some Glimmer hot foil for my sentiment. I have this copper color and this thank you from a set that I got. I really love the font on this one. I ended up using Vellum because I wanted to make sure you could see some of the design, even though you won't see a lot of detail. Then I kind of made it so that I could fold over the two side pieces, and then in the back, that's how I'm going to adhere my vellum piece so you don't see any glue in the front. So I wanted to layer this on top of a tan piece of cardstock. This is an 8.5 by 11 piece of cardstock by Recollections, and I just folded it in half. I knew that was going to be too big, so I do end up cutting this down once I see what size I need it to be. So I held my background piece up against it and just used that to cut around it. I also did cut out a mat out of gold cardstock. I used some double-sided tape to adhere my background piece to the gold. And then I used some foam tape to adhere the gold piece to my card base. That gives it just a little bit of dimension, and it makes the focal point still the flower and the petals. And that is my completed card. I had so much fun with this technique. I've wanted to try it ever since I've seen Leanne's videos and how beautiful her prints turn out. I think with practice this could be even more interesting and more fun, and it gives a good way to use different gel prints in one. So you collage them together and make these really beautiful prints, but then you can turn it into a beautiful card as well. So thanks for following along and thanks for watching. I'll see you in my next video. In the meantime, happy crafting, y'all.